Hello everyone and welcome to the motion debrief series of the APIIT ISTC brought to you by the Sri Lanka Debaters Council. My name is Gavin Senaratne. I am the debating coach of Royal College Colombo and also a member of the engineering faculty debate team of the University of Moratuwa. The motion that I will be covering from the APIIT is the round 3 motion on animal rights. And before we get into the specifics of the motion, there's something that I want to observe regarding animal rights motions over the years. They fell out of fashion a while back, which is because animal rights motions used to just objectively be the government passing policy regarding animal rights and so on and so forth. And over time, what we realized was that it was a bit difficult for one side in these motions, the pro animal rights side in these motions, because you had to show how animals deserve rights, even if it comes at the cost of human happiness or human rights of some sort or livelihoods. And that's just a difficult way up to do. So the motions fell out of fashion for a while. We didn't see any animal rights motions, and now they're somewhat making a comeback with a modification. So we set the actor as like an animal advocacy group or something like that in order to give the pro animal rights side a chance. We give them the fiat that you do care about animal rights and you want to and that you want to promote animal rights as well. So that's just something interesting that I wanted to note, that I thought of when I saw this motion. So let's get into the specifics of the motion, which is this House believes that animal advocacy groups should emphasize environmental concerns that arise from animal exploitation over the suffering of animals. And some examples for animal exploitation, for environmental concerns, are given in the motion as well. I'm sure that will be in the description down below. All right. Now, with this motion, I wanted to start with side opposition. And the reason for that is that this is a motion where you compare two sides against each other. So, what I mean by this is proposition is supposed to support emphasizing environmental concerns. Opposition is supposed to support emphasizing the suffering of animals that come about due to animal exploitation. And these are very clearly defined. So usually opposition or proposition will have more freedom in the kind of line that they choose in the debate. In this case, however, your goal is clearly defined. So for example, opposition cannot come up and say, yes, we want to de-emphasize the environmental concerns, but instead we want to focus on the health concerns that come about as a result of consuming animal products. That is not a reasonable strategy that opposition can take in this debate. So that's just one thing that I wanted to point out about this type of motion. And this might seem something very obvious, but the reason I point it out is because a lot of teams do make this mistake. All right, so once you understand how to do the comparison and how to avoid, bringing in unnecessary comparisons, let's move straight into the debate. And obviously, when you see a motion, the first thing that you need to do is to identify the key terms in the motion. So in this, we have animal advocacy groups, which is obvious. Environmental concerns have been explained in the info slide or like in the motion itself. So there's no need to go into that. And okay, the suffering of animals is an important point here. So side opposition is defending status quo, right? You're defending what's happening at the moment. So you're defending the way that in animal advocacy groups portray the suffering of animals in status quo. And this is something that you need to like follow the news, you need to be active on social media to know about. Because I mean, if you don't know how animal advocacy groups are portraying the suffering of animals in status quo, then it becomes very difficult for you to do this debate. So what does this look like? Well, I think of maybe those videos that you see from PETA, PETA, the organization, where they, for example, play audio clips of like animals screaming when they are being exposed to suffering of some sort, where they show the terrible conditions that these animals that are farmed for livestock live in, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of graphic imagery that we see from these animal advocacy groups that portray the suffering of animals. But what are animal advocacy groups specifically? And you really need to identify this because you understand this when I get into the arguments. Animal advocacy groups specifically are groups that believe that animals have rights, that animals deserve rights in the same way that humans deserve rights, that these two are sentient beings, and that all living beings or all living things just have this right to live, or right to live free from torture, and so on and so forth. Obviously, animal advocacy groups also probably do understand that animals are not entirely the same as humans, but the disagreement is on like where you draw the line. So for example, you don't think that animals have the right to vote or freedom of expression and so on, but you do believe that they have the right to live and the right to be free of torture, and like have freedom of movement and things like that. um, and as a consequence of this, what are the kind of things that animal advocacy groups oppose? So the most basic things would be they oppose the animal product industry, where you don't want like meat, milk, or eggs being farmed from these animals. But they also probably don't support institutions like zoos, or natural history museums or aquariums or whatever. And to a certain extent, some people might even say that they don't like pets, and holding animals captive in that fashion either. So that's just the broad understanding of animal advocacy groups. And the reason we want to develop that understanding is for us to make a principled argument of sorts. Because if you really think about it, the fundamental belief of this group is that animals have rights, right? And you want to protect those rights as an end. And what I mean by that is you want to protect those rights for the sake of protecting rights. Like that's your whole purpose. But what happens when you start emphasizing these environmental concerns, when you start saying, okay, just support these animal rights, because if you do, you will save the environment. um, what you're doing is you're taking a consequence of protecting animal rights, which is your fundamental goal, and saying, try and achieve this fundamental goal for the sake of reaching those consequences that we point out. And what that does is it somewhat undermines the key idea behind your movement. It undermines the idea that animals deserve rights. Instead, you're telling people, look, it doesn't really make a difference if animals deserve rights or not, but protect animal rights because it protects the environment. And just fundamentally and principally, that seems like a bad idea, because you're not upholding the values that the movement stands for. A parallel to this would be, for example, if the feminist movement said, it doesn't really matter if women have rights or not, but give women the right to work and vote, because the economy won't function well unless the entire workforce is participating. Um, and you can see why this kind of approach would be problematic for a movement, and it would undermine its own values. Now, it's very difficult to kind of prove why undermining a movement's values itself um, is so damaging, as to why the advocacy groups should care about it to such a large extent. And that's where you need to think about the stakeholders and the potential harms that may come about as a result of you undermining your own values, or you buying into like these secondary values. So what are the stakeholders that are involved with this motion? I mean, obviously you have like the state, you have animals, you have the animal product industry, all these obvious things. But when you're thinking of a movement or an advocacy group, or like some kind of group that is fighting for certain rights or fighting for a certain ideology, there are also like various groups in society that you're focused on. So for example, there are your opponents that you're focused on, then there are the people who are in the middle ground that you're trying to convince that you're focused on, and then there are your supporters. And the second idea that I want to focus on is with regards to your supporters, because the supporters who are there right now, who support you because they believe in your core values, that the suffering of animals is something that should be prevented, simply for the sake of preventing the suffering of animals and no other environmental concerns, these are your most ardent supporters. These are the people who are most likely to come to a protest. These are the people who are most likely to donate to your cause and things like that. What happens when you undermine your own core values and you say that, protecting the environment is more important? What that means is you're more likely to alienate these individuals, these hardcore supporters that you have. And that's not really something that you want to do, because that means that you're going to lose, those critical people who come to the protests. You're going to lose those people who just donate to you every month, and that could potentially negatively impact the animal advocacy group itself. The third point that I want to cover is with regards to the other stakeholder, which is the people in the middle, not the people who outright oppose you. I don't really feel like they are going to be a huge part of this debate, but the people in the middle, that you're trying to convince. Because that's the whole point of the motion, right? You're changing your messaging in order to convince a bunch of people that you're not convincing right now. The argument that I thought of here is, and this is also where you compare the two methods of messaging, because look beyond it even further. What is the purpose of emphasizing environmental concerns, right? In that scenario, you're trying to make yourself seem rational. You're tying your movement down to like a very specific harm and saying, okay, look, here's the negative consequence that humans are going to feel as a result of violating animals' rights, and here's why we should stop it. And here's why we should pass these policies to prevent the exploitation of animals. It's a very straightforward, logical, analytical argument to be made there. What's the nature of focusing or fixating on the suffering of animals? It's completely different, right? This is more of an emotional, moral argument where you're appealing to people's feelings, where you're showing them, look at all this suffering. These are sentient beings. These are beings that have thoughts and feelings just like you. How can you commit such acts of violence against them? And both of these kinds of messaging have their own um, pros and cons, right? And the main pro that you get as a consequence of this like moral emotional messaging is that it catches people's attention. It gets people involved, right? Because with something that appeals to your emotions, it just gets you more involved than something that appeals to your sense of rationality or logic. So the nature of the messaging when you focus on the suffering of animals is such that it's more likely to get people more engaged. It's more likely to get people to like reshare your message all over the place. It's more likely to capture that audience of people who will hardcore buy into your values as a movement. And that's the difference with this nature of messaging. The thing with the more logical, rational type of messaging is, while it might make you seem more credible, it might make you seem like a more rational movement that has a clear goal in mind, it doesn't really interest people. It's boring. And as a result of that, you need to question whether or not it'll achieve your goals of like spreading your message out there and captivating audiences. So that's just the third point that I wanted to show, that actually focusing on the suffering of animals would be an effective form of messaging that reaches a wider audience and captures them more to engage with you and to share your message. So that brings me to proposition, and obviously there are more ideas that can be used for opposition. You know what? If you think of any ideas, please share them in the comments down below as well. And if you got to this point in the video, just say something in the comments too, because I'm not entirely sure if anyone would watch this far. Okay, but moving on to side proposition. So moving on to side proposition, you're going to be doing a lot of the same that we've done with side opposition so far. As in, you've got to understand what animal advocacy looks like right now. You've got to like define the key terms in the motion and so on and so forth. And the reason that I did opposition first was so that now you have a good understanding of what status quo is like, and you can take the steps necessary to try and improve upon status quo. And where we'll begin with is with the messaging argument that we used previously. Because the messaging that was used relies on emotion, right? And it relies on causing this moral outrage within these people. But that in itself is a double edged sword, because that makes these animal advocacy groups seem somewhat immature. It seems like their problems are trivial, that their problems don't really have any impact on the real world, and that you have no reason to give up on your happiness. And again, to understand this kind of thing, you'll be needing to follow social media, you need to follow the news and whatnot. Because, if you see the memes regarding vegetarians, for example, you'll understand that the typical approach is to ridicule these animal advocacy groups. And as a consequence of that, one, the movement isn't credible, but two, people feel like there's no real urgency. And even among the people that support the animal advocacy groups, there's no real reason for them to see why they should support your views right now, right? And why they should like lobby the government to pass these animal rights bills or whatever in the moment. And what I mean by that is that often the animal advocacy fight is overshadowed by other issues in the media. You could have like, humanitarian issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict. You could have other discussions regarding other social justice issues, for example. And so as a result of that, the animal advocacy movement just becomes undermined in general, and it's not taken seriously, and it's not considered to be a group that has urgent issues that need to be addressed. And that's what you're trying to solve by emphasizing on the environmental concerns. See, if you identify this problem, then the reason you emphasize the environmental concerns just flows naturally, right? Because now we recognize that the environmental issue is an urgent issue. It's been well established that if you don't, solve climate change, the world's going to go underwater, and it'll be the end of the world in 50 years from now. So there is a sense of urgency and a sense of necessity associated with the environmental messaging. And what that means is that you can use that same messaging to um, show the necessity and show the urgency of the kind of changes that you're proposing as well. You can show that, animal rights is something that we should care about right now, even though a lot of things are going on around the world. And this weighs against the idea of capturing attention through something that appeals to their emotions. Instead, you're capturing their attention through the sense of urgency, through the sense of immediate action needs to be taken. And that's how you like balance these two viewpoints against each other. And that's the other benefit of having like a more rational, logical movement, because you're able to say, look, here's the exact reason why you should support these measures that the animal advocacy group is advocating for. And that's a very powerful argument that you can make. But you can take this one step further. Um, and again, this is like an idea that I got when I was thinking of this argument, and I can't really explain how it, flows from analyzing the motion and analyzing the key issues. And sometimes this happens in debates. You're also going to get arguments that you can't really explain how you got the inspiration for the argument. But anyway, just continuing with it. Um, this is a very effective method that that like grants you the ability to pass legislation, because you see, when you have the animal rights issue, and this goes back to the issue that I pointed out at the very beginning of this video about why animal rights motions fell out of fashion, which is that governments really don't care about animal rights, especially if it comes at the cost of making their constituents unhappy, because there's no logical reason to do it except empathy for the animals. However, if you are able to prove that there is an active harm to the environment, and that this harm to the environment will come to bite back humans at some point in the future, that's the point where you can actively lobby the government to pass legislative change that ends up in the increase of rights for animals. And that's a particularly valuable argument, because like all the activism in the world and all the donations and marches and protests and whatnot are useless if you don't get any kind of legislative change. And so the argument here is that this motion gives you a pathway to achieving legislative change by tying your demands, or like by tying your policies down to a reason that the government can also get behind, because it's something that benefits their constituents at the end of the day. So that's just another point of argumentation about legislation. And the final idea that I want to deal with on side government is regarding the perception of the animal advocacy groups as well. Because earlier I told you that there is this negative perception surrounding the animal advocacy group. So what you're going to do is you're going to kind of combine yourself with an existing movement. And what that does is it helps you win over or like absorb the perception of that group onto yourself. So what you're going to do here is you have the environmental movement that is already established, that is already considered to be a very logical, a very important movement for society. And by combining yourself with the environmental movement and pushing these environmental demands, what that's going to do is it's going to help you take on like the characteristics of the environmental movement. It's going to make you seem like a more rational and logical movement. And one thing that this does is, again, in terms of the kind of groups that you're targeting, right? Such as your supporters, the people who oppose you, and the people in the middle ground. The thing with using like logical messaging as opposed to messaging that causes moral outrage is that it's more acceptable for a wide range of people. As in, no one's going to vehemently oppose you, and no one's going to ridicule you on social media for saying, look, you need to support animal rights because it saves the environment. Whereas people are going to do that if you say, like, think about the cows and the suffering that they're facing. Because some people are just going to find that idea straight up ridiculous. Whereas this kind of messaging is more palatable for people. What that means is it's going to be accepted by a larger group of these people on the middle ground, and it's also going to result in less backlash against your movement as the animal advocacy group. And just as a whole, it's going to recharacterize you as a more credible and a more logical and just a more rational movement in general. So those were the key ideas that I had for side government as well. I guess you can go even further than that and talk about other impacts as well. Once again, if you do have any ideas, please drop them in the comments below. I'm sure anyone else who watches this video will appreciate it. And that brings an end to this video from my end. I hope you all learned something, and we hope to see you all again in the next debrief series happening soon.